Full time in the semester, I know. Nothing going on. No midterms to worry about. No midterm in this course. All right, a couple of updates. Lots to go through because the core of the argument gets made today in some ways. Mentioned last week that the first edition of Video Game Law will be put on a wiki on the course website. I have rather miraculously found all the original Word files, have the permission of LexisNexis, and have shipped it off to UBC Center for Teaching, Learning, and Technology. We'll try and push them, have a meeting with them this Friday. We'll try and push them to format this. I don't, we can reformat it later. I kind of just want to get it up as quickly as possible. So have done everything I can and will now try and take it to the next level. It would be great to have it up this weekend as you guys research. What I think is really potentially useful, and I have to make sure this feature exists, is that it should make, if my understanding is correct, it should make the entire text of the book searchable. And for research purposes, that seems useful. So, so I'm not off of that. So wonderful contributions to the website this week. I'm still catching up on some of your contributions, but it's really ramped up. And I'll talk a little bit more about one particular thread in the next couple of minutes. But has anybody actually received a badge yet? Okay, so I'm wondering whether it's in beta. So a couple of things to note. Badges won't be retroactive to the beginning of the course. The badge feature went online basically coextensively with last week's class, so anything that's been posted since then will work. And I'm working on a larger post in FAQ. I'm wondering if nobody's received a badge, and I know the number of contributions that have been made, so there should be some badges. I'm wondering whether it's sort of in a private beta for the Center for Teaching, Learning, and Technology. I'll try and make sure that's turned on as much as that's turned on this week, or at least I have an explanation to you. But we have a meeting on this on Friday, so I'll certainly know a whole bunch more. This was a wonderful post, and I would recommend that everybody read it because it brings together, at least certainly for me, and I think for you it will as well, a whole bunch of threads that we've talked about in the course. In terms of the nature of games and the strand of pro-structuralism and what that ultimately may mean to where the law needs to go in this area. It really is a great post, and it got a whole bunch of response. I'll try and not figure out, I know how to do it. I'll make it a featured post so that it's it appears on the sidebar and is easy to find. But I suspect this may be when we want to all riff off a bit. Which I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the pro-structuralist stuff because I'll come back to it at the end of the course. Looking forward, I started discussing this, as I often do, with kind of the more difficult elements of this course with Dr. Kimberly Voll, who's my colleague at the Center for Digital Media, and she thought that the thread that we're on was cool and applicable. And she mentioned two things. One is this post, which is similar to another slide we had a few weeks back. In fact, the slide that in a way started this whole post-structuralist thing in my mind, about who we are when we play games. And you might recall that post was about someone watching their significant other create an online identity and how it made them feel and how it kind of played with the reality, pardon the pun, of who we are. And this is kind of a further post on that, and it certainly doesn't mention post-structuralism, but it tends to support the notion that when we play, we are so many different things and not who the developer wants us to be. That we are very much not only part of the dialectic, but in fact directing it whether we realize it or not. And then obviously legal implications of that. The other thing that Kim mentioned, and here, this is my bad, because Kim's been telling me about this game for a long time, and there is a demo. I am going to try and play it, but she says this is absolutely integral to the post-structuralist argument. It's mentioned in the initial post as well, and that's the Stanley parable. So you can tell your other professors that I have forced you to play a video game. I'm not forcing you to buy it, but I'm suggesting that we all spend a few minutes, or at least watch the YouTube piece, which is only 2 minutes, and will give you a bit of an idea. So that's more or less it. I think the really, really difficult piece, and one I'm simply not prepared to deal with today, is if video games are post-structuralist, what are the implications on contract law, on EULAs, and terms of service? That is a really big topic, and right now I'm finding it to be a vexing one, and I need more time to work it through. So where are we? First part of the course was means of creating, and I just want to highlight copyright in terms of both a power and a constraint. How it enables the owner of the copyright to do certain things and gives them certain powers, and how it constrains others. And obviously I'm telling you that for a reason. And then we're really towards the end now of connections. Means of connecting, and again, connecting transforms and restrains things. And there's, you've been hanging around me long enough to know that these word games have disproportionate importance, so we will come to that. But connections and creativity have a interesting commonality. And I don't have an answer. This is one of those, if a tree falls in a forest and no one hears it, or as I tell it to my wife, if a husband says something in a forest and there's no one there to hear him, is he still wrong? Creativity. Does creativity exist if it doesn't connect to the world? If there's creativity in a forest and no one there to see it, is it creativity or isn't it? And that's maybe just a Zen cone, but in its own way, it comes back to this post-structuralist argument. And I don't know that there's any reason to have a definitive answer to that, because paradox has its own important role in getting us to think more deeply. But when we look at all of this, I want to sound a clarion call of warning, because it seems to me that what we are doing with end-user license agreements and terms of service is actually going against a very long trend. And you may well disagree with this, and that's totally fair. So you remember we talked about copyright perhaps being part of the democratization of thought, and talked about how originally the right to censor a creative work belonged to the king. It then went to Parliament. It then went to a regulator. We had John Milton's wonderful Areopagitica speech to Parliament against licensed printing, which didn't succeed. And then in the history of all of this, copyright existed, and there's an interpretation of copyright that it is, in fact, what gave creators the rights over their work, and that was, in a sense, in a very strong sense, an anti-censorship right. And just sort of one more interesting historical fact, and that is that copyright in a purely Western idiom perhaps predates the popularization of the notion of free speech and free expression. So when you think of where the Statute of Anne falls in 1710, the notion of free speech wasn't at a state of development that we now understand it to be. And the popularization of free speech really seemed to be associated, the mass popularization of it really arguably is associated with the French Revolution. So what else could you do except copyright if you wanted, make it a pseudo property right, if you wanted creators to have control over their work? This is very, very difficult stuff. It requires a real academic paper to tease out these ideas, but think of it that way. So now, if you locate where we are on the course and say, okay, there's been this liberalization of expression that goes back hundreds of years. We've now seemingly turned a switch. which is what we're going to explore today, in two different ways. I'm going to do my thing for the next 40 minutes, and then Don McGowan of the Pokemon Company International is going to show the other side of the coin in many ways, which is how contracts can be used, forgive me, Google, for good, and to actually create stuff. So it's a bit of a point counterpoint, but I'm really focusing on the larger structural aspects. So the question posed over the last 2 weeks has been, we are now in a contract-dominant world. Does it mean we're in a post-IP world for practical purposes, for consumer purposes, for the way we really live and the way we really interrelate and interact with games? And does that post-contractual world simply change all of the rules? And if it does, then what about this trend towards liberalization that's happened for the last couple of hundred years? Have we set it back? That's the clarion warning. That's the dark side that we're going to be talking in and around today. So, word games. The symmetry is pretty clear. And it's pretty clear just in terms of how the course is structured. Creation seems to go with copyright law. And connection seems to go with contract law. And if you think to your first-year contracts course, so much of how we mediate our relationships with each other legally in society, especially if we're going to be really conscious in our relationships, ends up being around the formulation of some sort of contract. Employment, all the really important things. Employment, property, money. You've already signed a ton of loan agreements. You all have credit cards. It's nice to think that entertainment on one level is so important to us that it comes to the same level. Hold the thought. So, a couple of nasty questions, and Don may want to take some of these on and react to some of them in his talk. But it may be that this trajectory of liberalization has led to a contractual backlash. Those in power, with power, or who have power over what they feel to be their stuff, their ones and zeros, want to set the terms of the relationship. That's not completely unusual. What makes it unusual is that these are, in essence, mass contracts of adhesion, which is a bit of a redundancy because contracts of adhesion all have a mass quality to them of some sort. But we're talking about millions of people signing the exact same agreement. And then there's sort of the really ugly side, which I keep alluding to, and does the copyright law even matter anymore? because we're putting so much of this in the contractual realm. Awesome for lawyers, potentially awesome for all of you. But is it the right way to do it? And then the third one, do freedoms exist outside of contract in a post-IP world? And that, if they do, is going to come by some sort of reimposition of law over contract. And where does that exist? That exists outside of the game world in consumer protection legislation. It obviously exists in a constitutional setting, but you know from first-year constitutional law that at least not directly does constitutional law affect contracts between parties. It affects contract law and how it's formulated, but not the actual personal relationship. So your relationship with the Stanley Parable and the developers and distributors of it is not directly a constitutional issue. So it's not, finding where law will set aside contract is much more difficult than you might think it should be. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the context of EULAs. And where I'm going to go over the next little while is essentially to say, do we really need them at all? Do we need these contracts? Which perhaps will strike you and perhaps ought to strike you as a shocking question. You're in this law school. You're in law school. You have been taught the paramountcy of contracts. You have been told that your very jobs depend on it. I'm looking at the right-hand corner and somebody who I know his job depends on it. If he didn't draft contracts, his job would shrink by what, 30%?
I get to sue a lot of people.
Sorry?
I get to sue a lot of people.
You get to sue a lot of people, yeah. But if contracts didn't exist in your world, your day-to-day would change. Big time. So before we get into that, in terms of actually looking at whether we need them, I want to go back only 2 slides to say, okay, so where is contract under some sort of threat? And Jaz Purewal, who will be joining us from London in a couple of weeks, wrote this really interesting post about what's happening in Australia, and I won't spend a lot of time on it, but it's really about Australia taking on Steam directly, and in his view, for the first time, applying consumer legal rights directly to games. And I'm going to underline the word directly because, as you'll see from some of the things I'm about to show you very quickly, there have been other consumer-ish interventions that had to do with games, but they also had to do with other apps, and the principle was more widely applied. And what's interesting about Jaz is pointing out that this is sort of more laser beam focused on games, and that's what makes it interesting. This is, and it's coming directly from a regulator. This is the first regulator, to my knowledge, which is specifically investigating the topic of digital distribution platforms' compliance with consumer protection law, particularly regarding issues like refund rights, et cetera, et cetera. So just a very quick survey of issues. Not about Australia, but the kinds of issues that are coming up that are consumer protection-like issues, or straight-on consumer protection issues. The whole free-to-play games issue. Now, this is about meetings and discussions and how these things should be mediated and dealt with and self-regulated. But none of these are all pretty recent. Valve pulling a game from Steam because it may not have been marketed honestly. This is about advertising being misleading because of the fact of microtransactions. Misleading free trial for a game. This one, I think, is a bit stretch, but class action complaint accuses Sony of false advertising because the allegation is that Killzone is not really a 1080p game. So that's consumer protection-ish. Now, a little more contractually oriented. So this is not a EULA or TOS issue, but this is a really interesting one and just happened or just made the press in the last week. Anybody see this? Okay, so Middle-earth: Shadow of Mordor is a brand new game that's out, I think, this week. And if you wanted, what this story says, and by all means, please go to it, is that if you wanted to do a review or a playthrough and didn't want your posted review or playthrough if you used copyright materials from the game, which you know by now is inevitable, and you didn't want it taken down because it infringed copyright, and I mean, ultimately you'd succeed, but at least the takedown might happen in the short term. You had to sign an agreement that was produced by the PR firm, presumably produced by the PR firm. I hope it wasn't by the developer. And I'd like to think they didn't know anything about this. It made you agree to a whole bunch of things, including persuading viewers to purchase the game. This is all done by contract. Think of consideration. I want to not be impeded in my review of the game. That's my consideration. Therefore, I enter into a contract that assures me that I will not be impeded if I do certain things, which may include, in essence, giving a review that I don't need. And the alternative to that is to say, well, I have integrity, so I'm not going to put up the review. Or I'm going to put up the review outside of this, have it pulled down, fight the pull down, and eventually I'll succeed. But it's going to arrive arguably later than the other reviews. So think about how this game works and how contract law, not that it's a bad thing in and of itself, facilitates this sort of nonsense. And again, this is the allegation. Those who didn't sign the branding agreement and made their own, found their videos taken down by a YouTube content ID claim. Now, that's quite possibly actionable. So this may be too far. And then this is very common if you sort of follow the press in this area, and that is, and it's important because it'll come back later on as a point, is these policies change all the time. Everybody who gets notice of the change in an end-user license agreement, a privacy policy, or terms of service, and reads it every time, please put up your hands. Yeah. And the truth is, what do we all think? At least, I know what I think. I somehow convince myself that I read the original document, which I know I didn't, and therefore this can't be much of a change over the original document that I didn't read. So why should I bother? It makes no sense. And it's a wonderful cycle. The real study, there have been studies that I've shown you and a few more that I'll talk about today that demonstrate that we don't read this stuff. I think the real study that needs to be done, the real bit of academic work, is on the psychology of why we don't. Because maybe somewhere in there we'll learn something that's useful. There you go. So, back to words. Thank God this is law school. I couldn't get away with this anywhere else. I want you to focus on the difference between constraint and restraint. It's a really, really pivotal difference just based on a couple of letters. Constraint is coercive. That's sort of the most negative way of putting it. And restraint is a control mechanism. And the definitions reflect that. It's compelling someone versus controlling someone. Constraint or restraint is control, constraint is coercion. And here's what I'm going to suggest is the point. If you look at copyright law, it's constraining. But I said I wouldn't talk about post-structuralists, but I have at least gotten this far. it has play in it, in the Derrida sense. Copyright law requires that you look at the facts in the relationship, right? Each relationship is a unique snowflake, is a unique point, and so there's play in all senses. There's room to move, and what the constraints are also move. So you have multiple moving parts. It is post-structuralist. Contract law is restraining and highly definitional. It's what we do as lawyers. We set up clear barriers, and if we don't have that clarity, and you'll learn this when you get into practice if you haven't figured it out already in your drafting exercises, you're really, really nervous. Until, and I don't know if Don will agree with this, until you're later in your career and you start, I got the thumbs up, and you start realizing that it's actually to the benefit of your clients to have play in the system, because you're going to avoid more litigation by having something to talk about and mediate and work through than go to war immediately, because there's just this giant barrier and it has unforeseen, unfair results, which happens all the time. And I'm sorry if this sounds like just an old guy grousing, happens all the time with young lawyers. And you can almost see a contract that's been drafted by someone in their first and second year. And I say that with great compassion because I know you'll be in your first and second year soon. And the temptation to put up thick, high, and absolute barriers is very great and very dangerous to the ultimate interests of your clients. I still have the thumbs up? Yeah, sideways. All right. So the point being that constraints go with creation and copyright law. Restraints go with contract law. At least they tend to. So, this is, sorry, a lot of words, but you have to look at what contracts are. So, remember that companies are drafting, consumers are not. Click-wrap contracts and browse-wrap contracts are, for the most part, enforced by the courts, far more than the most part, in almost all cases. Something I've mentioned before, there's a peculiar lack of standardization here. The contracts are, broadly speaking, similar, but from a consumer perspective, you're not looking at one standard form. If we had one standard form EULA to read, and that applied to all of our apps, or even all of our games, even if you took a subset. I'm not going to say most of us. I'm going to say many of us would actually read that. Here's your end user license agreement for the year 2014. This is the one you read. You don't have to read anything else till 2015. Not from every company. but one that all the companies that you do business with agree to. And maybe I might even be okay if that was deviated from, I had to read a paragraph that said, you know, we've deviated from the standard form. Please agree to this. This is how we've deviated. I might even go for that because it's a 30-second or 1-minute exercise. Now, I would only go for it, and this is kind of where the psychological part of this comes in. I wonder if the reason we press agree is on some psychological level that we feel it's an act of protest. We need to get to the stuff we want. If we read it, then we have knowledge of it. We know there's absolutely nothing we can do to change the contract. I'm not going to put anyone on the spot who happens to be in the room, but I've asked many general counsels, gee, do you ever change the end user license agreement for a consumer? Because you must get lots of letters. Not so much.
Just to add to that, I think your point about just wanting to get to the stuff is perhaps the most accurate. They did some studies in computer security where people were given a set of instructions to follow, simple instructions like, you know, go to this website, do this. The website was configured in advance by the researchers to display like a big, bold, 48-point font red warning. Going to this site will infect your computer with a virus. And people still clicked, yes, continue, because I want to get to the stuff.
Yeah. I think that's right. I think there's also elements of what Mavis was talking about last week, and that is these things are, they're designed to get us to say yes. So there's a whole bunch of questions around that from a consumer protection standpoint as well. Should end user license agreements, I guess I don't have a slide for it, but next year, should end user license agreements look like warnings on cigarette packages? Big, bold, you are agreeing to things that are probably not good for you. And you should know that and think about that. I mean, why do we have warnings on cigarette packages? For consumer protection reasons. Now, this is nowhere near as serious. No one's going to lose their life because they signed or agreed to something in a contract. But some consumers have lost a fair bit of money fighting after the fact terms that they've agreed to. So another problem with all of this, and I know Don will agree with this, is because these contracts are all individual, they're subject to the individual drafting quirks of individual lawyers. And this is a sign I saw on vacation. Dogs on sidewalk only. This is my example of bad drafting. Okay, so where do the humans go? If the dogs are the only ones who can be on the sidewalk. So we now go from copyright which we have expanded, and certainly expanded in Canada, thanks to the Supreme Court of Canada, in terms of users' rights, to contract, which removes users' rights, to this question of how do you reinsert users' rights? And now you get into the philosophical, political debate. Do you rely on, and I'm going to put it in a pure video game context, do you rely on the video game companies to do that? And there's some evidence that they will and that they have. And I'll cite permissions within context to allow modding and to allow the use of copyright material by gamers for certain purposes. Or do you use consumer protection legislation to deal with these issues? And I tend to think, not for political reasons, but for structural reasons reflected in this slide, that it's almost inevitable that it'll come in a consumer protection way. And that Jas Purewal's, what he has sniffed out this week in his post is, I think, more reflective of a trend that already exists than he says, but is essentially predictive of where this is inevitably going to go. Why inevitably? Because when you're looking at the ethics of something, it's very useful to examine double standards. And there's just too many double standards here. In a big data world, where your individual existence is addressed and catered to in a really, really significant way, the notion that your contract can't be individualized just seems palpably false. Just doesn't hold water. It's just not true that there aren't ways, it cannot be true, that there aren't ways to have a dialogue, even an automated dialogue, about what you accept, what you don't accept, what the consequences are, et cetera, et cetera. Especially in a game environment. You could gamify the entire experience. So it just doesn't wash. And the second aspect of the double standards test is a really simple one. How many developers can survive the terms they impose on others? Now, they'll argue they do. We sign these all the time. I think there's a certain disingenuousness if that would be the answer. So, this notion of tailoring rights has some narrow precedent. In Max Payne 3, and this isn't the only example of this, people who cheated were not banned from the game. They were put with each other. It's very post-structuralist, right? It fits. It makes sense. That can be blown up. Now, don't we need EULAs in terms of service for the really bad stuff? For the Gamergate stuff? For the horrible stuff that can happen? So, next couple of minutes, briefly, let's just look at the cases. We went through the cases last week for a reason, and that's in many ways to set up this slide. Almost all of the end user license agreement cases, and I tried to show you all the ones we have in gaming, don't relate to the really bad stuff, but they relate to commercial issues. There's your first warning sign. That the end user license agreements, at least in terms of what filters up to the courts, ends up being about commercial things. And if that's what they're about, it's certainly not unfair to say consumer protection is a viable response, since this is all in a commercial realm. And the Davidson case and the iRacing case, the mod cases, are the clearest example of that. Now, the Bach gold mining cases that we went through last week are more ambiguous because they're both about gamers' experience and others, and the developer possibly offering the same features. The in-game dollar case is an example, and as you guys know, or should know, or I'll tell you now, Blizzard did introduce the same features at a subsequent time. Now, the dark side of this is that end-user license agreements in terms of service are used as censorship tools. Full stop. You may agree, you may not agree. There are good and bad aspects of that. But again, sorry to go off base, but this is a little bit like the Trinity Western issue. Do you allow contract to create a private relationship that wouldn't pass muster when held up against the general law of the land? That's essentially the TWU law school argument. When you look at contract law versus freedom of expression, gee, I don't have a hard time picking freedom of expression, but maybe you do. I doubt you do because you're law students. But and then here's the real point. In all the cases we looked at, and I believe in good faith that I've put all the cases that actually exist in front of you, and I could be wrong, but I really tried. Causes of action other than violations of end-user license agreement, other than violation of contract, were available in all those cases. And you can read on your own. I sort of go through the pleadings and the cases and show you which ones are available. And in many cases, it's multiple causes of action. And that raises, do it on all of these, give you some footnotes, and that raises our end user license agreements. Do we need them like we need a fish on a bicycle? Do we need them at all? I get that they're convenient. I get that from a developer standpoint or a distributor standpoint, they feel necessary. But are they what we used to call belt and suspenders? And then, there's really fun stuff. You saw as we went through contractual clauses last week some of the odd things, but this is sort of my favorite from the World of Warcraft end user license agreement. These are the things we don't read. This is what you have to do if you want to terminate, if you want to stop playing the game, in essence, and you want to terminate your contractual obligations. You have to do a whole bunch of things, including notify Blizzard of your intention to terminate the end user license agreement. I wonder how many notices of termination they've received by email from the millions of people who've played World of Warcraft and, as we know from the statistics, aren't playing it anymore. So they must be just flooded with these notices of intention, just flooded with them. Like they must be adding people to their legal department just to read those. Sorry, I was posting on our website something about the unattractiveness of cynicism, and I find myself right there. Just more stuff. Wonderful website. Terms of service didn't read. Go there if you want to laugh. And many other ways other than contract, including, Joel Bakken may not be afraid of it, and I may not be really afraid of it, but regulation. Technology may help solve this. The market's certainly reacting. There was an attempt at legislation in California. It didn't pass. The privacy, but this is actually from the legislation. The privacy policy required by this section shall be no more than 100 words. So this is a very viable direction. That is not regulation per se. It's a statute. It's impacting the law of contract directly. You can say whatever you want in those 100 words, but it can't be more than 100 words.
This kind of reminds me of Republicans often on a platform where they're going to introduce a law that requires every new law you have to repeal one law. I think that sounds attractive to voters, but I don't think that's very practical. And 100-word privacy policy, I'm not sure how much can actually be achieved in a privacy policy.
I completely agree with you, and I'm almost 100% sure, I can't guarantee it, that Ed Chow was a Republican. I mean, this does have that scent to it. I'd much rather fulsome, thought-through regulation and consumer protection legislation without limits as to words. This is kind of this does strike me as a gimmicky way of gaming contract law to allow freedom, but restrict the parts that you the consumer effects you don't want to have. Also, in less than 100 words, Don and I can easily write a end-user license agreement that basically says, you have no rights without our express permission. How many words was that? So the 100 words, couldn't agree more, is not meaningful. But it does show that there's thoughts. There's lots and lots of words. Sarah Grimes, who is a professor at the U of T iSchool course and a graduate of this course, did a wonderful piece on terms of service, terms of play in a children's context, if anybody's writing a paper on that. And just lots of stuff if people are doing papers in the area. And one final thought, I don't know if anybody saw her, but Orly Lobel, who is a professor, gave a visiting talk here a couple of weeks ago, which I was privileged to attend, and she was awesome. And she addresses not end-user license agreements, but a different contractual term. And she talks about restraints on mobility in employment contracts, non-competes in employment contracts, and particularly in tech employment contracts. And one of the points she makes, among a whole bunch of others, many of which reflect the arguments, are reflective of the arguments that we've just gone through, is the parallel stories of Silicon Valley and Boston, which in the 80s had very similar profiles in terms of technology. MIT being in Boston and sort of being a tech corridor, if you will. And there's a number of academics are saying the reason Silicon Valley has boomed, and although Boston has done okay, it's basically not done nearly what Silicon Valley has done, is because in California, restrictions on mobility put in a contractual employment agreement are not valid. So you got people moving around and carrying ideas. And again, you can sort of see the post-structuralist map in all of this. Whereas in Massachusetts, they are much more strictly enforced, and people stay in the same place, and they're not mobile, they don't carry their ideas. They do end up getting sued, or the covenants are enforced against them. And the academic suggestion is that in part accounts for the different trajectories of Boston and Silicon Valley, and why Silicon Valley has expanded so much. In other words, freedom is good. So where do we go from here? Multiverse theory. Do we just live in the sort of post-IP world dystopia, contracts that supersede all other laws? Or do we find another way, probably through consumer protection? Next time we're going to talk about the future, but it'll, I promise you, come back to this issue. And I want you to just think about something that I'll talk about a lot more next week, but that is at the heart of all of this. Why does law respond so slowly to tech change? And I'm going to suggest that there's an answer. And there's lots of symptoms that it does. And what I'm going to suggest to you is that communication tools actually impact the law, and that there is a chicken and an egg here. And how we communicate, the language with which we communicate, which is formed by our tools, impacts the ethics and laws that we create. And there is the arrow of time, and you can't just loop it backwards. How we communicate, the tools we create to communicate, eventually seep into law. The way you perceive ethics and law, because you're a different generation, brought up on different communication technologies, is going to be different for me. And on and on and on. And that will eventually get into judgments and decisions when you get to the bench. So there is an answer to all of this, and what I hope to show you next week is that every communication technology, every major one, created new legal memes. And then just for fun, if nobody's seen this, it's well worth reading. And in all the time that I know you have, you know, are we just does none of this matter, including this course, because we're actually just living in somebody else's computer simulation. And there's a pretty good argument by Nick Bostrom of Oxford that we in fact are, and that there's a reasonable likelihood that we're just the Sims. Let us switch over in the next 2 minutes, and we will go from there.
So what I'm going to talk about, I'm going to kind of fly through my slides, and I'm also going to be super rude and put my watch on the table, but that's mostly so I can stay on time rather than because I'm bored of you. You are allowed to be bored of me, but I hope you won't be. I'm going to talk about the role of contracts in building a franchise. Right? I've worked on some of the biggest franchises in the gaming business and some of the biggest franchises in the industry. I've also worked on some of the biggest feature films in the industry in the sense that I've worked on the Halo and the Pokemon movies, neither of which you've ever seen. So I can tell you that sometimes as a lawyer, you're going to do a lot of work and it's not going to pay off. That sucks, but that's life. I'm also going to talk about some of the other things that happen when you build a franchise. And that's talking about product placements and fan interactions. And those are two specific things. I have a fair amount of knowledge about fan interactions. It's funny, I also, you know, even listening to you talk about tobacco, I worked on Imperial Tobacco files, so I know why those warnings are there. I would submit it's not to do with consumer protection. I would submit it's because the Supreme Court said they had to be. But in any event, I also am the guy who, when I was at Xbox, wrote the first iteration of what Microsoft calls the game content usage rules, which is the things that allow you to take in-game content and put it in a YouTube video or make your own characters or use it to make machinima or any number of things. And that emanated directly from a situation where I was sitting in a room with the VP in charge of the business, and he was talking about how it was so awesome that people were making their own this and making their own that. And I was like, cool, you know I'm going to have to go sue all those guys tomorrow because they're breaking the law. And he's like, well, no, we want that. And I said, okay. So what you need to do is you need to structure a world in which they're permitted to do it. Because if you don't structure a world in which they're permitted to do it, people are going to come along and do a bunch of stuff you're not going to like, and I'm going to have problems. And so sort of going back to the theme that you heard in the first hour, I say this by way of saying I don't look at contracts as restrictions. I look at contracts as a thing that permits the world to experience things it wouldn't have otherwise experienced. Okay? Because definitionally, if you come to somebody and you say, I would like to have this thing that you own, copyright's property, right? I want this thing you own. Okay, that's fine. I will let you have access to this thing I own so long as you accept, I know there's this bunch of rules, just like you're allowed to take shortcuts through my yard if you need to get somewhere, but I want to put some restrictions on there. I want to restrict your shortcut to this certain path. Well, if you accept that, you're kind of ill-situated to complain about it later. And that was the quid pro quo for you getting access to this stuff. Now, you and a lot of other people want access to some interesting stuff that these people make. These games are fun. That's the reason that people end up playing them. They don't play them because, ooh, a lot of business strategy went into it. They don't sit there saying, this was a well-generated, I mean, I do because I'm a dork, but most people don't, right? And franchises, of course, as we all know, exist outside of the gaming space. I'm going to talk a little bit about why they exist in the game space. But I would say, as you want to think about something that, if you dig this stuff, if you want to work in entertainment, right, games, movies, TV, whatever, you could do a lot worse than to go watch the Lego movie. Because the Lego movie is, I think, the quintessent franchise building property. Lego's whole ethos is you can do anything with Lego. And they have absolutely made that into a movie. 2 hours of that will be the best 2 hours you'll spend thinking about how to build entertainment. Mandatory weasel words, I always have to do this because I do work in the industry. What I say does not represent my company. I may take positions. I ordinarily don't take positions that are all that divergent from what I say in front of a classroom. But certainly there's a world in which it's possible. Facts can change. Generic statements sometimes don't apply on a specific fact, etc. And I do spend a fair amount of time in front of a classroom. I also teach entertainment law at the University of Washington. What you're seeing in some of this stuff is some portions of it are adapted from my class. And there's one slide where I reference a case or a situation that I'm not going to talk about here, so I'll just gloss over it very quickly. You should feel free to ask your questions whenever. Do not be Sean Connery. Do not shave your questions for later. Interrupt me. Stick your head in. Cut me off. Tell me I'm an idiot. Whatever works for you guys. The first thing to think about is it can be hard work to build a franchise, unless it isn't. Right? There are really two ways to build a franchise. Either work really, really hard or be a Kardashian. I'm going to throw it out there. None of you is a Kardashian. I am also not a Kardashian. So we only have the one other option for us. You could also make the argument, by the way, that Kim Kardashian has worked very, very hard to build the franchise called Kim Kardashian. She took advantage of the opportunity presented to her by her father's fame in the O.J. Simpson murder trial and springboarded that, but worked very, very hard at it. The one that I think has worked even harder at it and has been very successful is Paris Hilton, which, if you think about it, there is no, everybody has their opinions about Paris Hilton, but she hasn't flamed out and burned out the way so many other people in that space and that genre have. And that's because of the absolute micromanaging of her image and her presentation that she's done. It looks like they're not doing anything. There's a lot of this that's hard work. So I respect a certain amount of the hard work that goes into stuff. Now, I also respect the fact that 1 million people downloaded Kim Kardashian's game because she's Kim Kardashian, and it's terrible, but they play it anyways. What I'm going to talk about, though, is more of the traditional franchises. Anybody here familiar with Destiny? I have particular love in my heart for Destiny because Bungie left Microsoft to go make this game. I love the guys at Bungie. They work across the street. Their office, by the way, is awesome. It's a converted 8-plex movie theater. It's got a climbing wall and a haunted house in it at Halloween, and it's ridiculous. And they left to go make this game. I also love it because it's one of the only game development contracts that's publicly available. I don't obviously expect that you guys have gotten it, but when Activision got itself sued by the Infinity Ward guys, the Call of Duty guys, and they left, one of the things that they requested, as you do in American litigation where you request every document under the sun, is they requested all development contracts that Activision had signed with third-party developers, one of which was Bungie, one of which was the Destiny contract. And that somehow, because it was a public document, somebody saw it, pulled it out of the court record, and posted it on the web. It might even still be accessible if any of you wants to see what an Activision development
We do
contract
want to
looks
see
like.
it. So we will find it. We will find the
Well, I can
link to
certainly
it.
shoot it to you when I get home.
Please do.
But it's an actual contract. I love it personally because a lot of this, because that was their first contract after they left Microsoft, so a lot of it keyed off the circumstances of their departure from Microsoft. So it's like reading my own contract with them when they left Microsoft through a funhouse mirror. Like, there's this section on, why would it matter for their departure from for making Destiny whether Halo Reach got a certain Metacritic score? And I'm like, so, I'll certainly, I have some amount of knowledge in there. Like I said, I can't always tell 100% of my story. I'm also not going to read wall of text at you because wall of text is deadly. But there's just some amount of contracting that has to have wall of text in it. So I'm going to walk through some of the things that are in the Destiny contract, knowing you haven't read it, because but I'll sort of call out what these things are and how they go into building a franchise. This is also going to be a pretty highly pragmatic 45 minutes of your life. If you don't ever want to be a lawyer and you want to go be a lobbyist, I don't know, go start drinking because it's past 11. But if you want to work in the business, in any sort of business, right? These are the kind of very pragmatic and practical things you're going to need to think about. So the first thing, what is the property of this Destiny game? Well, Bungie developed the IP, and in fact, it's a guy named Jason Jones who developed the IP, and Jason's a really good guy, and he came up with this idea of this universe called the Destiny universe. So, as an aside, there is this very interesting phenomenon you run into in all entertainment businesses, where people say, they talk about the IP, And I will even do it. They'll say, like, the Destiny IP. Well, what is the Destiny IP? Well, ironically enough to these guys, it's everything except what you think IP is. I actually sat there once with somebody and had them say they don't own the IP, they just own the copyright and the trademark. And I was like it was like talking to the dog. It's like, literally, that is what the IP is. That is the absolute literal, what do you think the IP is? And they're like, the IP, what are you, an idiot? Like, and they're talking to me like I'm the dog, right? So you have to, the first thing you have to think about when you are working for a creator is, what is the thing that they are licensing out? What is the thing they think they're giving away? Now, this raises a particularly difficult problem in the Destiny contract, and in all of the contracts you'll look at for things that aren't yet made. Because you need to describe with specificity something that doesn't exist yet, which is a maddeningly difficult problem. Because think about it in the context, just think about it in the context of a house, right? You hire a contractor to build you a house. And as an aside, if you want to work in video games or entertainment in any variety, and any of you are 2Ls and you have another year left, do they call it 2Ls up in Canada? I forget, because I went to school at McGill, and McGill we call it some weird French name. But if you have the ability to take a construction law course, you would do very well to take a construction law course. It feels like it should be totally unrelated, but construction is a bunch of stuff built, unfolding in time for which we pay you along the way. And that's basically what video game and movie contracts and TV contracts are, is we're going to pay you along the way to build something, and you're going to have it when you're done. So think about a construction contract. You're just grabbing a house. I'm going to build you a house. Well, what's the house going to be? 2-bedroom, 2-bath, whatever. In Vancouver, 2-bedroom, 2-bath for $1.9 million. But what it's going to be is, it's going to be a thing that you're going to see it when it's done, and it's not going to match perfectly the thing you saw in your head. And so you as a lawyer need to figure out a way to write down, how will I do this thing that doesn't match the thing that I saw in my head? So here what they did was they said, a series of entertainment software products developed by the licensor, which is Bungie, called Destiny. And then they gave all these wonderful magic words: exclusive, non-transferable, non-sub-licensable. What that basically means is Bungie gives Activision the right to publish some games. Products is games, platforms is platforms, which is PlayStation 3, PlayStation 4, Xbox 360, Xbox One. I love Microsoft math, the way they go 1 to 360 to 1, or like 1 to 2 to 3 to 3.1 to 3.11 to 95, 98, and then XP 2000 Vista 7, 8, 10. Perfect. This, by the way, is why EULAs are so screwed too. So what does this tell you? It tells you that it's a publishing rights deal, and it tells you that Bungie wants this property to be more than games, because they've limited it down. Because remember, Bungie is the owners of the IP. And because they're the owners of the IP, they own everything. And Activision, because it's property, and any use of somebody else's property, let's not forget, is presumptively infringement unless you've got a defense. Activision has to know what they're getting. Bungie has to know what they're giving up and what they're retaining. So, what that rights grant tells you is that Bungie, unlike a lot of other developers, has the ability to hold stuff back. Because what you're going to see from the Activisions and EAs and Ubis, I don't mean to pick on Activision, it's just their contract, right, is they buy everything. There's a general principle that I teach in my own class, which is you always want to buy in chunks and sell in slices. Because if you buy in chunks, that means you're always going to have all the things you think you need, and then probably a little bit more. If you sell in slices, you have the ability to sell it again. Music is a great example for that. Music is terrible, by the way. Don't become music lawyers. Because music is like they sell in time, they sell in space, and they sell in slice. You can have the right to make a CD of music. CDs are these little plastic things that you put inside. Plastic is this. Anyways.
The ones without EULAs.
Exactly.
That's
as an aside, I think for the 3DS, Nintendo finally started putting EULAs on their handheld games, but for years and years, Nintendo didn't have any EULAs on their games. It was just a straight purchase and sale situation for the cartridge, and they relied entirely on copyright law. But, Nintendo isn't very important in the video game business, right? So, in any event.
Anymore. Sorry.
You're done. You're fired. So in any event, moving forward, what you see, just sort of to talk about the money, right? And I'm putting up the money here both because it's a lot of money and because it allows us to unveil some things. Activision paid all of Bungie's development advances. So they paid They covered Bungie's overhead for that studio. Remember the 8-plex movie theater? Guess who paid the rent? Bungie, but with money paid for by Activision. All the employees, there's 250 people who work there, ranging from lawyers to HR people to coders to developers to artists, musicians, all paid for by Activision. The score of that game was scored by a guy named Marty O'Donnell, and they hired Paul McCartney. I guess Sir Paul McCartney. Guess who paid for Paul McCartney? Guess who paid for everything? Word on the street is between the marketing and the development costs, Activision paid $250 million for this game. Aside, remember that in the video game space, unless you have something to keep people around, like movies, you have theatrical release, and then you have like hotel rooms, and then you have airplanes, and then you have HBO or whatever, the Canadian HBO, like premium cable and then basic cable, and then over-the-air television, you have DVDs and streaming video and everything else. So you have all these ways to make your money back. In the video game space, you functionally have one channel. You have DVDs, and you have about 3 weeks before those things start showing up used at GameStop. And unlike in GameStop, or at GameStop, where unlike a new copy, GameStop buys it for $35 from the publisher and sells it for $70, the used version they buy for $10 from the player and sell for $55. So that's a way more profitable business. So your main sales channel is driving people into the thing that doesn't pay you. So you do everything you can to want to maximize the money up front and maximize the return that keeps people hanging around and not selling off that disc. That's why map packs and downloadable content, that's a part of the economics of that business. Aside, I don't know that I love that Shadows of Mordor example that you heard in the first hour. I do know that I get where they're coming from with it. The last thing you want when you have 3 weeks to make all your money is bad reviews. It's kind of ironic because Shadows of Mordor absolutely rocks, and this has a couple of really cool gameplay mechanics that I expect to see get ripped off, and I hope at some point you guys are going to discuss the copyrightability and the patentability of gameplay mechanics, because there's some very interesting stuff in there about ripping off gameplay mechanics and what can you do, what can't you do. But in the Bungie case, so they got all their stuff paid for. They got a $2.5 million bonus if they were on time and on budget. So they were on time and they were on budget. And so they got $2.5 million, and they're going to get, it's per year because they have stuff they have to release year and year and year, right? Downloadable content. And then, not that I'm telling tales out of school, but it's a 4-game development contract, and the first one sold in like 9 million units. There's going to be a sequel. Had they been late, they would have had their royalty rate reduced. So they have a 20% royalty rate on certain sales, and then I'll get that in a second, and then 24, and then 35. Those rates would have dropped to compensate Activision for the lost sales. That's partly because Activision very much wanted to be the first major game title to hit for this Christmas. And that's why that game launched in September. Never forget that when you're thinking about this stuff, there's a lot of stuff going on in the background. There's no contractual whatever that says we want to be the first game for Christmas. But there are windows for things that make sense. Games never release in the summer, at least not big ones. Movies never release in September, October, because the kids are going back to school. But the kids are at home, and they're starting to be indoors more often, so that's gaming. Mom doesn't want you indoors in the summer, so games don't release over the summer. That's when you go to the movies instead with your friends, because they're all out of school, and you can all stay out late. And this is the stuff that actually goes into the thinking outside of the contracts, is you get this very sort of business sense that goes on in the thinking on each side, and then it manifests and reflects itself in the contract. So if you're Activision, and you had this game slip from September to November, you're not the first game anymore. You're now releasing into the teeth of, something's coming, you don't know what it is. As it turns out, it's Microsoft is going to drop a Halo compilation. They're also going to drop Halo 5. You're going to hit against Dragon Age. You're going to hit against Sunset Overdrive and a bunch of other games that are going to compete for purchase dollars with your property. So you want to contractually protect yourself from that in the ways that you can. You can't actually say this game must release in September and you must have the game ready for September because this is an American contract, so we actually have a constitutional issue there. You have a functionally the same here. I just don't think we have that actual statute. We have the 13th Amendment with banned slavery. So as it turns out, if you say to somebody, you must work for me, that's literally slavery. You must work for me because you signed a contract saying you would. So you can't do that. So instead it's that, okay, you don't have to release it for September, but if you don't, you're going to wish you had monetarily. And that's the way, incidentally, they've worked around. That's why when you heard in the last hour, contracts of non-compete contracts are void as a matter of public policy in California. It emanates from the California Constitution about that particular topic. And contracts of personal service and outlawing slavery. I incidentally would give a slightly different explanation for why Boston didn't go as well as Silicon Valley. And the question relates to two things, one of which my man is wearing a Habs hat, which tells you you have to be a Bruins fan if you live in Boston. And as a Vancouver Canucks fan through the ages, 2011 was a very tough year for me. But the second reason is, have you been there? Have you felt the weather in the valley? Have you felt the weather in Boston? Why the hell would you live in Boston if you could live in the valley? Right? Aside, people often ask me, like, so what's it like being Canadian, which is the dumbest question in the world. But I say, imagine if the most awesome weather you could ever hope for was Seattle. And it's not quite as bad. Right? So that's functionally, we have Hawaii. We have, like, California. Why would you live in Boston? But I digress.
But the Bruins reason is actually the one that came to my mind as well.
I weep openly for that. I wasn't there for that game. I was, ironically enough, in Montreal. But I used to have season tickets, and they were second row in the corner, and I gave them my brother, who's a Canucks fan and a Bruins fan, which means he's just evil. But he was the only person in the arena happy that night.
And you're originally a Montrealer.
Well, actually, my parents lived in Vancouver when I was a kid.
Okay.
But I'm a Montrealer.
But you're a Habs fan because we all spent time. So, just a small bit of disclosure. The reason I never went to Toronto to practice law, where all my friends and colleagues went, was I absolutely refused to go to any city that had the Maple Leafs as their team.
Toronto's terrible.
No, and that was serious. I actually meant that seriously at the time.
Toronto hope goes to die. Anyways, post-release payments. So Bungie made there's the amount of money they made. Operating income is the definition in the contract of net revenue. So after they deduct all their expenses. So Bungie's making 20%, 24%. They're in the 35% recovery. And it's like income tax brackets, like the first $100 million is 20%. But these guys are going to make a ton of bank, and Activision's going to make a ton of bank. 9 million copies of a game sold at between $70 and $150 per unit. Of course, there were the collector's units that sold at $150. Doesn't take a rocket scientist to know that while Activision is going to be covering their rent going forward, it's not because they don't have any money anymore. And God bless these guys. I love them. So God bless them for making all that money. They got the threshold bonus of income. They're not going to get the game ratings, the game rankings one. The best review of Bungie I saw was that it's the only 77 Metacritic game that everybody wants to play. And it's absolutely true. Reviews, by the way, are massively important in the industry for a very simple reason. Go back to that, we're all contracting for something we don't know yet. So if you're on the publisher side, if you're the person who's paying $100 million to make a game, and $100 million development budget isn't crazy. Like that's about, making these games now costs about what it costs to make a big budget feature film. You're just not paying for actors' time on screen and a couple of other things that make films cost a little bit more money, camera crews and stuff like that. But functionally, the effects costs in movies and the effects costs in games are more or less the same. So you need something to know whether the game is going to be popular and whether the game is going to make it worth your investment. And so that's why people put ratings-related bonuses in game contracts. So they shouldn't matter, but they do. Now for a little bit about why you have franchises and sequels. Go back to that thing that I said earlier about how you got 3 weeks to make all your money. Well, if you've got 3 weeks to make all your money, then what you desperately are looking for on the acquisition side is a known quantity. Would you rather take a risk? There's actually the studies on this, right? And they, if any of you read Freakonomics or any of those books, because I know you all have so much spare time, but I know in the summer when you're bored and you've been doing document review all day, that say, you get those people who are like, would you rather take a certain shot at $1 million, or would you like a 50% chance of making $10 million and a 50% chance of making nothing? And the vast majority of people will take the $1 million because it's bird in the hand problem, right? Well, that influences everybody at every level. So would you rather take a chance on something brand new, or would you rather have a sure shot at something you know is going to sell a certain knowable, definable quantity of units? Think about everything you see in the industry, right? Bungie was a new IP. Destiny was a new IP. But Bungie was a known quantity. They made Halo. Halo made the Xbox. I was there, I know. Halo made the Xbox, right? So that's a known quantity. Go look around Kickstarter is an even better example, right? You hear these stories about, oh, this game got funded for $5 million on Kickstarter. That's either known developers or legacy IPs that are being rebooted. Like the Shadowrun game, if any of you ever downloaded that, I did because I know the guys that made that too, and there's a thing in their Kickstarter video where they talk about, we don't own the rights, we had to license them from Microsoft. Why don't we own them? Well, that's a complicated story involving lawyers. I was like,
Were you there when Halo first came out?
I wasn't there for Halo 1, I was there for Halo 2.
Okay. Because I always wondered how much does a developer know about how a game is going to do in its first iteration?
You rarely know.
Yeah.
What you do know so this is why you see people launching betas, right? Beside for all the good gameplay and load testing reasons, is because when you launch the beta, you know whether you need to, how big a success it's going to be, and that matters because remember, you're making those, especially not as much now, but you're making those little pieces of plastic, right? And those little pieces of plastic are still important because if you move only to digital download of a game, you better never want a relationship with GameStop again. Unless you're going to sell it on a little card and you're going to give GameStop the same kind of margins because they're GameStop. They don't want to help you sell a product they don't make any money on. And digital downloads they don't make any money on, right? So if in that case you need to make 2 million units of a game or 1 million units or 5 million or 9 million, you don't know. But remember, every one of these things you manufacture is a thing in the world. It costs you 50 cents to press the disc and pack it into a box and wrap it in cellophane. And then you got to store it in a warehouse. Do you need a warehouse the size of this room or do you need a warehouse the size of this building? That's rent, right? Everything you can do to know the success of these things in advance, it absolutely matters. And so franchises and sequels give you a known quantity. Now these can be sort of the relative success of a game, especially in advance when you're trying to lock down sequel rights, can be a very, very hotly discussed topic. One of the 2 times I've actually had somebody tell me that he wanted to fist fight me in the parking lot after negotiating a deal was on sequel rights to a game. The other time was related to a sports deal that you get me drunk sometime. But certainly, people care a lot about this stuff because if you're the creator, you don't think you're making derivative schlock, right? If you're going to make, let's just call it Indiana Jones and the Crystal Skull. Right? You don't think that's going to be a terrible movie. You think that's going to be awesome. And so you can't look at the person who's writing or developing or producing that movie and say, listen, Indiana Jones and the Crystal Skull is going to be terrible, but we all know we're going to make $1 billion. Right? The people who make Transformers movies they don't think they're making art, but they think they're making really cool stuff. They don't think they're just making something that makes money. And so remember that, right? Because you have to acknowledge to them that, yeah, we acknowledge that what you're doing is probably something I couldn't do, while at the same time, you want to make sure that you capitalize and grab all the money you can. So in order to make sure that you are able to take something and build a franchise, you want option clauses and sequel rights. So what you want is these 2 things. You want an option to pick up future works, and you want the sequel rights, which I'm going to come to in a minute. But certainly, it will say right in there, you either have an obligation at certain sales thresholds to make a second game. If Destiny had sold 500,000 units, nobody would be making it. But at 5 million units, they want to know that Bungie is locked in to make the second game. And that if not, there's financial penalties and everything else. Right? And so these things pragmatically tend to be on the side of Activision, of the publisher, of the film studio, of whoever, because they're the ones who want to know, okay, if we invest all this money, at least we know we'll get to take our money out over time, we'll get to capitalize on all the investment that we're making. Sometimes they're not found in adaptations of pre-existing content, but they are very often found even in those, right? And, any big Game of Thrones fans in here? Okay, so everybody's always talking about what happens if George R.R. Martin doesn't write the next few books. I haven't seen their dev contract, but I'd be willing to bet that there's a clause in there that says if he just decides he's going to flake out and start writing young adult fiction, that HBO gets to write the scripts instead. Because that would be the kind of thing that HBO would require and other content acquirers would require to say, hey, listen, we're going to spend a ton of money building this property. And we're going to pay, especially in the game context, right? We're going to pay your development costs along the way. We're going to cover the salaries of your 250 employees. The least you can do is make sure that if you guys flake out, we get to finish it up. No, this part is not over yet. I am going to continue talking about contracts just for a little bit longer because it is, a law class, I feel like. Copyrights and trademarks. Very important thing to keep in the back of your mind when you're working with a creator, when you are a creator, when you're advising your buddy who's come up with a game idea or a song or whatever. Remember, the general principle is, unless there's a work-for-hire clause in a contract, copyright's owned by the creator. Trademarks are owned by the person who comes up with them. It's not always as obvious as you think because the creator immediately, in many contexts, will assign their rights over. Hollywood scripts is the best example. Those are always bought as works for hire. The reason for that, you can make a ton of money, right? The Writers Guild deal for a Hollywood script for a major feature film gets you, you get what you negotiate, which will usually be around $1 million, but you also get 2.5% of the box. Well, that's some serious bank. And so because of that, you can make very good money on it, but it is a work for hire. And the reason for that is because if you're the studio acquiring it, you want to be able to make changes, right? You buy a Mission Impossible script, and then Tom Cruise shows up and does what actors do, which is say, that's a really cool line, my character should be saying it. Then you can't do that if you need to go to the writer and get permission, and the writer's a creator, and they're creative, and they've got all these artistic vision issues in play, and you want to spend $200 million on this. Yeah, I respect your artistic vision, but I also want to spend my $200 million and make $500 million with it.
The notion of moral rights must make you want to cringe.
So, as an aside, I think one of the most ticking time bombs of the industry, and games, movies, whatever, is outsourcing to Canada. I think outsourcing to Canada is a ticking time bomb, specifically because you guys have more rights. I mean, I'm a Canadian lawyer, so I shouldn't say you guys, but I live in Seattle. Canada is like America's, halfway house to the world, right? It's like, let's see if this will work in another country. We'll go to Canada because it's kind of foreign, but not really. But you guys have more rights. And Americans are just like, yeah, we waived it by contract. It's like, yeah, that's non-waivable, right? So what you get in contracts is you get a stipulation from the creator that they don't waive their moral rights. They waive such moral rights that they can waive, and the rest of them they covenant not to enforce. You try that. I actually don't think it would necessarily be as efficient as a lot of my colleagues do, but you do what you can. But I think that's absolutely a ticking time bomb. And then you get these small houses or small developers who think they're going to get away with it by a choice of laws and venue clause into California or New York or wherever, and it's like, yeah, good try. They're going to sue you in Canada, and the Canadian court's going to be like, oh, that's unconscionable, and keep the lawsuit, right? All this stuff about Steam in Australia, or Steam in Australia is the best example because Steam is Valve. They have one office; it's a block away from mine in Bellevue, Washington. You can have as many judgments as you want against Steam in Australia. They don't have an office there; they have no assets there. What are you going to do? How are you going to enforce it? Right? Australian Consumer Protection Agency. Good luck. You're going to come to Washington and enforce that judgment? Washington be like, forget it. It's void against our public policy. Right? Never forget that, you guys, you're in law school and you have to study this stuff and you have to understand that this is the way the rules work. But the second the rubber hits the road, things change massively. I have had conversations with people in my travels where we've said things like, that's illegal in Italy. It's like, I don't have an office in Italy. I don't care. Right? And what are you going to do? What's the Italian government going to do to a company that's based only in Canada? Go and bring the judgment? If you've taken any sort of administrative law courses, you know that administrative laws those judgments aren't usually reciprocally enforceable country to country. Tax is a great example of that. A tax debt can't be enforced in a foreign country on most tax rules. So it's like, okay, well, good luck.
Thank you for addressing that, because moral rights is one of sort of the memes of this course that has been evolving.
Yeah, and it's absolutely. I think it is a ticking time bomb. I think if somebody wanted to carve out a niche, in my own class, I spend the last hour doing a how to get a job lecture, and one of the things I tell people is carve your niche. there would be a lot worse niches to have than to be the person who is the expert authority on moral rights in the gaming or entertainment industry and in cross-border transactions. Right? You could do a lot worse than to be the person who is known to the industry as this person gets it. Right? That will start writing your ticket very, very quickly. Trademarks you don't usually deal with. You sometimes do. Bungie actually specified that they were going to retain them for Destiny, but you certainly don't all the time. And going back to the discussion of why you wouldn't necessarily deal with all of these things is it's money, right? Remember, I said I don't write my own rules. I don't write my own privacy policies. I don't do a lot. I barely practice law some days. Some days I sit there with a stack of tax documents on my desk screaming in my office. I used to be an IP lawyer. That's actually true. So one of the things that comes from that is you're going to spend money. Well, am I going to spend money registering trademarks at $50,000 registration? Am I going to register them worldwide? I mean, I've just registered a worldwide trademark for Pokemon for a project, and $200,000 to register it. Because if you want to register, sure, in Canada it's easy. In the United States it's easy. You get a community trademark registration in Europe, you're pretty much golden. But then you're in like Brazil, where you have to hire a local Brazilian counsel, translate the documents into Portuguese. Malaysia, where you have to get all the documents what's called consularized, which is I have to get a statement signed by my CEO. I then have to get it notarized by my in-house notary. Then I have to send it to the Washington State Secretary of State, who says, yes, a notary is the person who can commission a signature. Then I send it to the U.S. State Department, who says, yes, the Washington State Secretary of State is the people who would tell you whether or not this person is a notary. Then I send it to the Malaysian Embassy, who says, yes, the United States Secretary of State is the person who certifies it, and so on down the line. So it takes 6 months, and you pay all these fees, and you got a trademark in Malaysia at the end of it. What do I care? I only have an office in Washington. Right? So people actually have to think about that kind of stuff, and that's why this stuff doesn't get dealt with. Right? And that's why you can live in a world where it's everything's going to get dealt with by contract, and yeah, it's very sort of snow crash. But I think in the real world, you'll see a lot of this stuff will always be supplemented by laws, and it will be supplemented in weird ways, in weird environments, because the American regime is going to be very contracted, because that's where everybody is. And then Europe has things like the software directive, the EU software directive, and a bunch of other directives. It's like, yeah, good try with your attempt to do this in contract. We just carved through your contract. That 100-word privacy policy law would have been really interesting, because you couldn't write a privacy policy in 100 words that would be compliant with the EU Safe Harbor Directive. And so you'd be sitting there in that situation.